Hello, my name is Isaiah, and for my case study, I decided to examine the Kwintellin First Nations and their experience with the federal government in attempting to resolve their electoral crisis. The Kwalin are a First Nations band located in British Columbia's lower mainland near Fort Langley. Kwalin translates to tireless runner, which represents how the current band works tirelessly to uphold their values and traditions within their community. They have 7 traditional laws that govern their community, which are health, happiness, generations, generosity, humbleness, forgiveness, and understanding. In 2018, the Kwalin First Nations separated from their main band council and formed their own independent nation. You can find out more about them in the link posted in the slide. The KFN want to be able to elect their own band leadership and live without fear of being harmed for speaking their opinion about their current band council. In these matters, the Canadian government has refused to help the KFN due to their adopted hands-off policy when dealing with electoral systems. This case has some ties to colonialism because it shows that the Canadian government will only help First Nation groups who can be used to further federal government's goals. The KFN, like many Indigenous groups, adopted the officially recognized government that was put into place by the Indian Act. This government called for 1 elected chief and 2 elected councillors. Without consent from band members of the KFN, the chief passed down his title to his son instead of following the newly adopted electoral system. In 1989, the band council informed its members that they had followed a hereditary custom governance model in which the members had no say. This was a major deal because even prior to the Indian Act, band members always had some say in decisions that had to do with the band and its leadership. Later on, in 1991, some members of the KFN filed a federal lawsuit in which they described how they had an illegitimate leadership because the current chief was not elected by members of the band. Within this lawsuit, they noted that under the leadership of the current chief, the community had become worse off. The lawsuit requested that the KFN could have an election that was spectated by the Department of Indian and Northern Affairs Canada. The department thought this was unnecessary, mainly due to the department's hands-off policy. This means that if a band follows a hereditary model, the federal government does not have to intervene no matter how it goes. The main issue of this case is that members within the KFN want to be able to elect their own band council and chief, but currently are unable to because they lack aid from the federal government. The previous chief was vastly abusing the system by using his power to put his friends in positions of power and by using band funds for other personal needs. According to many members within the band, the current system is illegitimate because it was never voted upon by the band as a whole and was instead passed by the band council in secret. When hereditary electoral systems are put into place, it is virtually impossible for its members to get rid of it. This is because there is a lot of power passed on to the chiefs from the federal government, meaning that in order to get rid of this model, federal government aid is required. A second issue with this case is that the current band council is actively attempting to restrict its members' freedom of expression. Members of the band who were signing a petition to change the current band council reported that they were facing harassment, intimidation, and threats of violence from the band council and its supporters. The band council later introduced the Safe Spaces Agreement, which restricted members of the KFN from talking to non-members of the band about the current band council, which, as Jago puts it, is equivalent to banning Canadians from talking about the content of the Constitution to a foreigner. Within hereditary systems, the position of chief is passed down from the current chief to one of their children. Some First Nations bands would follow a patriarchal system, and others have a matriarchal system. These systems were a traditional form of government for many First Nation bands prior to the Indian Act, and in the modern day hold more of a symbolic and traditional role. Section 74 of the Indian Act led to the creation of the elected electoral system and forced First Nations bands to use this new system. This new system was meant to get rid of the traditional form of government, the hereditary system in many cases, and replace it with something similar to Western-style democracy. In the modern day, every 4 years, band members will elect a new chief to represent them. While these roles do not hold the same symbolic and traditional values as the hereditary chiefs, they still tend to have authority over traditional land and its infrastructure. The federal government's response over previous years has stayed pretty much the exact same, with them refusing to intervene in election issues because of the current hands-off policy adopted by Canada when dealing with First Nations, and especially their electoral systems. When band members originally reached out to Indigenous Services Canada, they were ignored at first, Then they were informed that they could not do anything as the KFN follow a custom codes electoral system and that they have electoral independence. To put this into perspective, when a foreign nation that Canada interacts with has unfair governance, the federal government is quick to demand a return to democracy. This can be shown by interactions between the government of Canada and countries such as Chechnya, Syria, Iran, and Sri Lanka. When members from a local newspaper called The Runner contacted a spokesperson from the Crown Indigenous Relations, they were told that the Kwintellin First Nations is recognized as having a custom electoral system and therefore elections are held under the community's own election rules, and our government respects the electoral independence of the KFN, and therefore any election-related complaints should be submitted and addressed in accordance with the community's election rules. While the independence of allowing First Nation communities to govern themselves without threat of the federal government interference is important and should be promoted in the Canadian government, it also shows that the federal government does not apply the same democratic values it shows to members of foreign nations to these Indigenous communities. The hands-off policy of the Canadian government can be seen as both a blessing and a curse for Indigenous communities. It can be a blessing because if the federal government intervened whatever there are complaints around an Indigenous government, there could be a bigger push for more assimilationist policies. These policies could be used in order to slowly get rid of Indigenous culture and their unique governments. One could argue that the hands-off policy shows the federal government commitment to letting Indigenous communities govern themselves. This approach to the Indigenous electoral system would be highly beneficial to the Crown Indigenous relations if the custom codes always created a fair and transparent government. This is also a curse, as it means the federal government will refuse to help Indigenous communities that needed electoral reforms, such as the KNF. This hands-off policy may stem from past interferences of the Canadian government in Indigenous communities and its past assimilation policies, such as residential schools. Also, it is important to note that the Canadian government supports Indigenous governments, which meets the need of the Canadian industry and are used to achieve their own goals. This was seen in the case of the Wet'suwet'en, where their elected chiefs were in favor of building a pipeline, but their 13 hereditary chiefs were not in favor of doing so. This brought into light the issue of how hereditary chiefs within the Indigenous communities could be halting progress, and made this issue a problem for Canada. The case of the KFN shows that while the Canadian government in the international realm focuses on principles of freedom and good governance by denouncing nations who fail to meet democratic values, this care is not shown to these Indigenous communities. These communities receive very little in the way of help or support from the federal government and told to deal with it themselves. It's almost as if the Canadian government puts the values of other nation citizens more highly than those of Indigenous, which could speak to Canada's deep colonialism values. This concludes my case study on the KFN and its attempts to remove its hereditary government. Thank you for listening.